Marxism, submitted by Armayan, Cheska L. Ebrano, Anamarie Jusay, Jerlyn I. According to Karl Marx, Marxism, the history of all previous societies, has been the history of class struggle.
Did you know?
Marxism is a difficult and contentious body of work, but it is also more than this. It is a body of revolutionary theory with the purpose of changing the world. As Marx 1976b famously said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This makes Marxist analysis political in a quite specific way. But this is not to suggest that other methods and approaches are apolitical. On the contrary, Marxism insists that all are ultimately political. As the American Marxist cultural critic Frederick Jameson 1981 puts it, the political perspective is the absolute horizon of all reading and all interpretation. The Marxist approach to culture insists that texts and practices must be analyzed in relation to their historical conditions of production and, in some versions, the changing conditions of their consumption and reception.
What makes the Marxist methodology different from other historical approaches to culture is the Marxist conception of history.
The fullest statement of the Marxist approach to history is contained in the preface and introduction to a contribution to a critique of political economy. Here Marx outlines the now famous base superstructure account of social and historical development. A. Classical Marxism. Marx argues that each significant period in history is constructed around a particular mode of production, that is, the way in which a society is organized, i.e., slave, feudal, capitalist, to produce the necessaries of life, food, shelter, etc. In general terms, each mode of production produces I. Specific ways of obtaining the necessaries of life, 2. Specific social relationships between workers and those who control the mode of production, and 3. Specific social institutions including cultural ones.
B. Althusserianism.
The ideas of Louis Althusser have had an enormous influence on cultural theory and popular culture. As Hall 1978 suggests, Althusser's interventions and their consequent development are enormously formative for the field of cultural studies. 21. Althusser's most significant contribution to the field is his different attempts to theorize the concept of ideology. I shall therefore restrict discussion to this aspect of his work.
C. Hegemony.
Involves a specific kind of consensus. A social group seeks to present its own particular interests as the general interests of the society as a whole. In this sense, the concept is used to suggest a society in which, despite oppression and exploitation, there is a high degree of consensus, a large measure of social stability. A society in which subordinate groups and classes appear to actively support and subscribe to values, ideals, objectives, cultural and political meanings, which bind them to, and incorporate them into, the prevailing structures of power. For example, throughout most of the course of the 20th century, general elections in Britain were contested by what are now the two main political parties, Labour and Conservative. On each occasion, the contest circled around the question, who best can administer capitalism, usually referred to by the less politically charged term the economy. Less public ownership, more public ownership, less taxation, more taxation, etc.
D. Post-Marxism and cultural studies.
The concept of discourse is central to the development of post-Marxism. As Laclau 1993 explains, the basic hypothesis of a discursive approach is that the very possibility of perception, thought and action depends on the structuration of a certain meaningful field which pre-exists any factual immediacy. To explain what they mean by discourse, Laclau and Mouffetot 09 give an example of two people building a wall. The first person asks the second to pass him or her a brick. On receiving the brick, the second person adds it to the wall. The totality of this operation consists in a linguistic moment, the request for a brick, and a non-linguistic moment, adding the brick to the wall. Discourse, according to Laclau and Mouffe, consists in the totality of the linguistic and non-linguistic.
Thank you for listening.